Hi, have you ever wondered about the educational system in a third world country and how closely related it is to personal development? Well, I'm here to tell you about just that. My name is Neha, and I have lived and studied in a third world country for almost 2 decades of my life. Due to the sheer constraints of the system, with its archaic design, caused a lack of motivation and loss of direction. Nothing that I did seemed to be good enough for me or the people around me. Neither was I developed into an individual with my own personality. I rode the human tidal wave just like others around me, yet found I had made very little progress. I found very little leeway in matters of choice and had to follow study paths that were of very little significance to me. I found I was being steered in a direction for which I was assumed to be more suitable for, a direction that was dictated by other people and other surroundings that they felt was the best way to go. However, in reality, it really wasn't, and I understand better now. But how and why? What is the link to my topic, you probably figure? Now, personal development is something that means different things to different people. It also differs depending on the place you come from, like India, for example. Even though personal development is now a focus of many books, lectures, and ideologies, it is still not something that is completely understood well enough to be executed on a day to day basis. To me, personal development is something that hasn't ever really been a topic of interest or importance by the people that surrounded me. This is because the mindsets of people in India work way differently than the way it works here in the more westernized cultures of the world. I would like to explain to you how and why with relation to the educational system in India as well. First of all, it is a common misconception that India has one of the most flawless educational systems in the world. If by flawless you mean rote learning and not paying attention to a child's needs or wants, then maybe you're right. However, for me growing up, I always wanted to be able to do things that I personally enjoyed, be it art or dance or even music. I was never the kind to really study from textbooks. I guess in a way I was more street smart than I was book smart. Being street smart is another word for being street wise. It refers to the ability of an individual to know how to deal with difficulties or dangers of everyday life in their own environment. And that definition of street smart always defined me perfectly, because no books could give me the knowledge that I used to brave the difficulties and dangers that I faced in the world. When looking back at all the children that grew up through the systems of education in India, this seems to be a problem that arises so frequently. Majority of them are book smart, which in some ways is a huge advantage, within sheltered walls, of course. But once put out into the tough and difficult world, they had nothing to defend themselves but the books they held in their hands and in their brains. A famous feminist critic, Camille, once said, "In the real world, very smart people fail and mediocre people rise. Part of what makes people fail or succeed are skills that have nothing to do with IQ. Also, the idea that intelligence can be gauged by an IQ test is erroneous. India is a country that is so run by success rates, grades, high class professions, status, rankings, amongst other things, which pressurize children to go in directions they aren't particularly fond of." I will now play a short clip from a famous company back in India, which was aired during the time of the statewide and highly important board examinations.
बात है शादी तो शोरूम में खाली टी-शर्ट भैया मरून ब्लेजर मेरे साइज में एक्सेल दिखा दीजिए
We've given our jeans for alteration yesterday.
I'm looking for white formal shirt.
ब्लेजर्स तो अवेलेबल नहीं है ब्लैक टी-शर्ट्स है सर
आज सिर्फ black t-shirt है.
Black and just XL size.
Yeah. कल तो ये नहीं था, आज अचानक.
भैया क्यों दिमाग खराब कर रहे हो नहीं लेनी ब्लैक टी-शर्ट
Where's the manager?
Is your manager here? Can you call the manager?
अपने मैनेजर को बुलाइए प्लीज.
He's the manager.
For the whole store, I have only one.
मीटिंग में मैं क्या करूं?
जो काली टी-शर्ट दिख रही है ना ये
बिल्कुल नहीं, let's go.
नहीं नहीं सर.
हेलो मैम, हेलो सर, सॉरी यू आर टू फेस दिस, बट आपको आपके कपड़ों में चॉइस नहीं मिली तो आपको इतना बुरा लगा। सोचिए ना मुझे कैसा लगता होगा जब मुझे मेरे करियर के लिए चॉइसेस नहीं मिलती। आई वॉन्ट टू बी अ गिटारिस्ट, बट मेरे पेरेंट्स नहीं चाहते कि मैं वो करूँ।
मेरे भैया को टेनिस बहुत पसंद था। मेरे पेरेंट्स को अच्छा नहीं लगा तो उन्होंने अलाउ ही नहीं
One
किया।
of my friend, he is very good in maths, so my parents are always comparing him with me.
क्या सबको 90% आना जरूरी है? Does everyone need to be a topper? अगर मुझे डांस में इंटरेस्ट है तो मुझ पे 90% लाने का प्रेशर क्यों है?
जैसे आप सबको हर चीज की चॉइसेस मिलती है, मुझे भी मेरे करियर के लिए चॉइसेस मिलनी चाहिए।
बात तो सही है तुम्हारी बेटा।
आपको क्या बनना है बड़े होके?
मुझे एक सिंगर और एक डायरेक्टर बनना है।
So you will be a director who sings. That's amazing.
रोहित शर्मा मुझे बहुत पसंद है। I like his full shot.
मुझे क्रिकेटर बनना था तो उस टाइम मुझे क्रिकेटर नहीं बनने दिया।
आप वही बनना जो आप चाहते हो, इट्स ओके।
So this is all because of you?
Yes. ये एक टी शर्ट सबको फिट नहीं होगी ना, तो सबको डॉक्टर बनना जरूरी है?
It's funny, isn't it, how annoyed people can get for something as mediocre as the lack of choice and unavailability of clothes? The message that this video tries to send across is so closely linked to my topic because this perfectly portrays and demonstrates to you and everyone around us how things work in societies and the educational systems of India. How children are forced to follow things they do not like, and how their voices almost and more frequently now go unheard. With relevance to myself, however, I was privileged to have parents that supported my decisions, listened to my wants and needs, and allowed me to be me. But unfortunately, not every child is as lucky. In any educational system, teachers are the ones that play the most vital role in the child's development from a very young age. But even today, that doesn't really seem to be a priority for them. Schools, along with its teachers, force children into doing things they don't particularly enjoy with a rather peculiar perspective in mind. A lot of teachers don't pay attention to the personal needs and wants that a child has. They don't encourage them, they don't support them, and in the end, if they don't turn out to be lawyers, doctors, or engineers, they have basically wasted their lives. The fault, however, doesn't lie itself with the teachers, but the structures of an educational system that they are forced to follow. Just as students have a fixed curriculum that has a fixed outcome, teachers too themselves have specific guidelines they need to follow in order to gain the results that are required by the educational system. There is no freedom of thought or speech that is tolerated, and therefore, as human beings, they themselves cannot inculcate their own values into what they teach. The lack of proper training that is given to these teachers is also something that causes a large issue with regards to the educational system. Most of these teachers aren't even taught the basics of a language, which arises the question of whether or not the child is really taught enough or are they merely taught what most the teacher themselves are educated in. Did you know that the way Indian schools receive their highest ratings is completely based off of how many students pass that year? It is, in my personal opinion, a rather devastating one, in fact, that an entire educational system that was at some point looked up at has now turned into something that doesn't deserve as much tribute. So, when you look into this more closely, you have students that are forced into rote learning, teachers who are barely trained themselves, and schools who just want their students to pass the grade in order to be successful and somehow be put out on a map. Whilst there are other factors that contribute to this, it is believed that the most learning that is done by a child is during the strenuous hours they spend at school. But the lack of presence, independence, and common knowledge of the teacher in their class amongst their children creates a huge rift in terms of their personal development. Other factors like society, politics, economics, poverty, lack of financial aid, psychological aspects, and parents also closely affect these processes. In more detail, with regards to these aspects, India is a country that is run almost entirely by its culture. The socio-cultural background of a family highly influences the youth when it comes to education. There have constantly been attempts to exclude the intolerance of religion, the various caste restrictions imposed, and the inequality that is felt by the majority. Even though it is something that is highly focused upon in the society itself, it is highly ignored in most educational systems around the country. Due to these societal differences, a number of students are forced into systems that guarantee them a place in society. It guarantees that they will have enough money, hold a recognizable education, and get an even better job, while conveniently ignoring the fact that children need to be nurtured and guided and not pushed into directions that are acceptable. Most of the time, these levels of negative encouragement push them to places of depression, eating disorders, and frequently the worst, suicide. On the other hand, whilst politics is an institution that could highly influence a society, it does the exact opposite by utilizing government funds collected for education to better their own state of affairs. It's safe to say that even though there is indeed enough money for the betterment of the educational systems, amongst other things, it isn't being used for it. Which brings me to the economic aspect of the country. Although the country has progressed a lot in terms of education over the years, there are still a majority of citizens that face challenges of unemployment, poverty, and lack of financial aid. These challenges directly influence the kinds of schools their young children can attend, if they can even attend school at all. However, while these aspects do play a key role, they aren't as direct and first hand as teachers themselves. The children of today are the innovators, pioneers, and imagineers of tomorrow, yet they are treated like products to achieve a certain prize. This is where the part of personal development comes in. Children suffer from a lack of personal growth through their years in schools because they themselves don't know who they are, they don't know what they like anymore, and most importantly, they are afraid of the choices they make because they don't want to be known as failures. During my research into possible educational systems that could indeed be ones that are more student focused and less focused on the curriculum, I came upon the Montessori approach on learning and the Waldorf Steiner method of teaching. These two methods deviate from what is taught in a normal educational system. They focus more on the development of the child, their personalities, their wants and needs, as well as their overall growth. The reason I picked these two was because even though they are indeed present as a different system of teaching in India, there are various factors that affect it from being fully utilized by the entire Board of Education themselves. These factors also include the previous aspects mentioned, like the economic, political, and social aspects. However, the thing that affects these methods the most from being utilized is the financial status of the country. The Montessori approach and the Waldorf Steiner method are methods that come from the more Western countries, which means that the training for teachers is special and therefore more expensive. The said environments are of particular needs which cannot be sustained for a number of schools in India. And the fact that it is so diverse and open minded, it isn't accepted by the citizens for their children. Even though India and its educational system could benefit highly from these kinds of teaching and learning methods, it is currently not possible to make it available to every school, teacher, and student. If in the future teachers could be taught these methods and children were allowed to follow these classes, they would benefit in various ways from it. They would learn the basic subjects that are needed to be learned, but while simultaneously also developing themselves and their own personalities. I feel personally that a lot of students would grow so rapidly and more progressively if they were allowed to be a part of such methods of learning and teaching. However, it is what it is at the moment. This is the educational system in India and the importance it gives to a child's growth. And this is something that a lot of people around the world are unaware of. So, what can we do as a community? How can we help these third world countries to better their educational system? In adaptation of the wise words of the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, how can we be the change that we would like to see in the future generations when it comes down to strict educational systems? Well, only you can decide that, and only we can help lead and guide the youth of today and of tomorrow.